get started. Today we're going to talk about a few topics. We're going to talk about tithing. We're going to talk about taking care of the poor, right? We're going to talk about the blessings as it relates to tithing and the blessings as it relates to taking care of the poor. All right. As I said in the intro, this is a response video to Pastor Keon Henderson and what he said about tithing and what he said about taking care of the poor. All right. So before we get started, let's listen to what he had to say about it.
This is how the devil keeps tricking us up. And here's the other problem with the church is that anytime a person is in need, y'all go to running and dropping money. But let me tell you something, the poor will be with you always. And there is no blessing connected to blessing the poor other than getting back what you gave to them, but no multiplication.
All right. There you have it. Loud and clear. All right. Now, as we used to say when we were kids, I'm going to keep it 100, right? I'm going to keep it all the way 100 with you, right? Pastor Keon Henderson is a general in the faith, right? Especially to the churches that are predominantly African American or predominantly black, right? And I, in comparison, am a nobody, right? I'm just a dude with a very small YouTube channel, right? But, and this is a big old but, right? Size doesn't matter when it comes to the truth. All right. So that's what I'm gonna give you today. I'm gonna give you the truth. It's gonna be irrefutable. Well, you can refute anything, but it will be extremely difficult to refute what I'm gonna give you today. It's gonna be clear and extremely logical for you to understand. All right. Now, tithing, what's that? All right. Now, was tithing created by man or was tithing created by God? Well, the truth of the matter is it's kind of both. All right. The very first person to tithe was Abraham. Right? If you go to Genesis, the 14th chapter, the 19th and 20th verse, you'll find a story about Abraham and a man named Melchizedek. Now, for some reason, Abraham felt it necessary to give 10%, the tithe. That's what tithe means, 10%, a tenth, to give 10% of his belongings to Melchizedek. Now, why he did that, it's up for argument, right? Now, Melchizedek, and the Bible says that Melchizedek was the king of Salem. The problem with that is, during the time of Abraham, there was historically no place called Salem, right? They say that Melchizedek, the Bible says that Melchizedek was the high priest of the Most High, or the high priest of El Elyon. The problem with that is, where did the priesthood come from? Because Aaron had not been born yet, and it was out of his lineage was the priesthood created, right? So it is verses like this, in all honesty, that scholars believe that it wasn't written during the time that it makes you think it was written. Right? Because it's referring to topics and geographical places that wasn't established when it was written. Right? The person writing in Genesis shouldn't know about Jerusalem. Right? And there shouldn't be a priest. So it is believed that this verse it was written actually during the time of after the Hebrew people had returned from exile, right? So that's the belief. You deal with that as you may, but that's neither here nor there. But either way, that was the first time anyone tithed. Now, every culture in that area was giving some type of honorarium, giving some type of some personal items to their priests, right? The Hebrew people weren't the only people giving priests things, right? But the concept of 10% is exclusively Hebrew, right? Now the Muslims had 2% during this time, but the idea of 10% is genuinely Hebrew. All right. Now, and this all happened maybe around 2000 BCE, right? Now, let's fast forward about 500 years. 500 years later, a dude named Moses came on the scene, right? And God expressly told Moses, I want the tithe, right? And God told Moses that the tithe is unto me. So it was Moses and God that formalized the tithe, right? Abraham and Melchizedek, it was a gesture. Moses and God, it was a law. And that's why it's written in Leviticus. It became a law. God made tithing a law. Now, if you read in Leviticus, God is clear about why he is formalizing the tithe at this point. God himself, the creator of all things, says, I have the tithe for the Levites, for the priestly clan. Why was that? Because the Levites has nothing. They received no land once they arrived in Canaan, once they arrived in Jerusalem, once they arrived in Israel. They had no land and they had no possession. So God said, I want to set up tithing for the priestly people. All right. So it was the responsibility of the rest of the 11 tribes to give 10% of their belongings to the priests because they were not given anything. Okay. So let's be clear. Tithing during the time of the Mosaic era and the law was set up to take care of the priestly clan, the Levites, the Levite tribe. Now, that's it when it comes to the historical nature of tithing, right? There's not much left to say about it, right? So, Pastor Henderson, however, believes that there is a hierarchy, that God has a preference as to which one you should pay attention to. According to Pastor Henderson, you should tithe more than you give to the poor. All right? That's the preference of God, and that God has such a strong preference for your tithing that he will multiply that his response will be in multiples, right? That's just how favorable and how much of a preference God has for tithing, that his response to you, the blessings that come from tithing, will be a multiplying, a multiplicious, I don't know if that's a word, type of blessings, right? As opposed to giving aid to the poor, God is like, good job. I appreciate that you did that, right? According to Pastor Henderson, right? But I want to show you something. Come with me, friend. Come with me to Deuteronomy, the 14th chapter. All right. We're going to Deuteronomy, the 14th chapter, and the 28th verse, and the 29th verse. Deuteronomy 14, 28, and 29, and it reads as follows: At the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shalt lay it up within thy gates. And the Levites, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the works of thine hand which thou doest. Now, again, Pastor Henderson seems to believe that God has a preference as to where you should give your tithe, as to where you should give 10% of your income, right? And that is to the priest, is to the church, right? But in these two verses, we clearly see that at least every 3 years, God, this is God speaking in this verse. This is Deuteronomy. This is another book of law. This is another book of Moses writing down what God told him. This is the verse of the creator of all things, who is saying at least every 3 years you will give your tithe not only to the priest, but you will give it to the widow, that you will give it to the stranger, and then you would give it to the fatherless. In other words, at least every 3 years, you're going to give your tithe to the less fortunate. Every 3 years, right? Now, if we're going to take what Pastor Henderson says seriously, and that God has a preference, then God's preference ends every 3 years when God instructed his people to share the tithe not only with the priests, but with the poor and the less fortunate as well. And while we're on that topic, what church does that? What church today, every 3 years or every 6 to 7 years says, you know what, don't give me your tithe. What pastor says, you know what, don't give the church your tithe. Go give it to that person that's homeless, right? Don't bring it to us. There's a lady that lost her husband. Give her the tithe. Don't bring it to. No church does that anymore, right? I'm sure that this part of tithing fell off very shortly after God said it, right? But anyway, you see that at least every 3 years, God felt giving the money to the priest and the less fortunate to be equal, right? Right. Let's look at something else. All right. Let's go to Matthew, the 23rd chapter and the 23rd verse. Matthew 23 and 23, and it reads as follows: Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye may pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Right, now here we go. Before, we had Yahweh speaking to Moses. All right, in this verse, Yahweh came to earth. Yahweh came to earth, put on a man suit, and said this out of the mouth of Jesus the Messiah. Here you have Jesus on earth talking. Here you have God on earth talking about the tithe, right? And apparently he's pretty upset, right? Upset about what? The Pharisees. Now that's not unusual. Jesus, while he was here, always had beef with the Pharisees, right? But here, Jesus was upset with the Pharisees and their ritual of tithing. Jesus was upset with the Pharisees about their tithing. The Pharisees was so convinced about the tithing that they tithed herbs, tiny herbs. And that's the problem that Jesus had with the Pharisees. Like, you find so much value in tithing that you tithe seasoning, right? But you neglect, what does it say? Mercy, faith, and judgment. Right? But I'm gonna focus on the word mercy right here. Right? And let's be clear, the word mercy definitely, absolutely refers to taking care of the less fortunate. Jesus was saying that you are so focused on tithing that you, Jesus' words, have omitted the weightier matter. Jesus called mercy the weightier matter. Not me saying it, it is the Messiah, the Son of God, right? God incarnate, saying that mercy is the weightier matter. Now, if we're going to establish some type of hierarchy, I'm going to go with the hierarchy that Jesus the Messiah creates. And Jesus the Messiah says that judgment and mercy and faith, these are the weightier matter. Okay? So, what have we said so far? That, well, at least 3 years, about 1,500 years before this verse, God made tithing and taking care of the poor equal. Right? Again, fast forward 500 years, and Jesus said it's a weightier matter. Taking care of the poor is the weightier matter. Okay. Now, at the end of the verse, Jesus says you should do them both, but it's clear that Jesus had set up that taking care of the poor, mercy, is the weightier matter of the law. All right? Listen, friend, when it comes to your relationship with God, there's nothing that you can do better than search it out in the Bible for yourself. There is absolutely nothing wrong with doubting, researching what your leader says. You should not take for granted that what comes out of the mouth of your leader, that comes out of my mouth, that comes out of your boss's mouth at work, and your pastor's mouth, you should not take for granted that they know what they're talking about in the moment. You should research it yourself. The Bible says, study to show yourself approved. Not take the word of your pastor verbatim as if it's written in stone. It says, study to show yourself approved. You're going to be approved. You're going to be a more foundational Christian, a more foundational spiritual person by studying, learning for yourself. All right? Jesus the Messiah was killed, and the veil to the holies of holies was rent because of it. Through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Messiah, we now have access to the holies of holies. We can go directly into the bedroom of God and have communion and talk to God and ask His version and ask what He thinks. Right? All of this stuff didn't happen so that you can assume everything that's coming from the pulpit is true. Now, I'm not here to disconnect you from your church. I'm not here to cast aspersion on your leader. Certainly not trying to cast any aspersions on Pastor Henderson. What I'm saying to you is what he said wasn't biblical and had you studied, had your consecration been where it should have been, you would have known. All right? So listen, according to Jesus, taking care of the poor is a weightier subject. Right? Now, I get what Malachi said. Malachi says he will open up the windows of heaven when you tithe and pour you out a blessing. I know the cause and effect of tithing. It's clear what God will do for you if you tithe, right? But that type of blessing isn't solely attached to tithing, right? Numbers talks about how God will bless you if you're generous to the poor, right? So at the very least, friend, let's do what Jesus said, right? Let's do what he says. Do them both, right? The verse says, these ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. You should do them both. You should tithe to the priest, but you should also take care of the poor, which is the weightier law. All right? I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to let that brew a little bit in your brain. All right? Let me know what you think about it. Comment in the comment section. If you don't think what I've said is true, let me know. If you agree, let me know. All right? It's okay to do both. But if there is a hierarchy, if God has a preference, it's taking care of the poor. Again, I gotta go. I say it every week. I mean it every week. Thank you for showing up today. My name is Jeff Staten, and this is Pressing Toward the Mark. One love.